Oh, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yusuf Goli. I am managing editor here at Daily Maverick, specifically on Maverick Citizen, the Daily Maverick platform that focuses on civil society. So welcome to our Inclusive Society Institute and Daily Maverick collaboration. Today's discussion will be asking the question, what does it mean to be South African? This is the opening webinar in the new series, exploring the foundational values of our democracy. So, what we aim to do today is kind of unpack issues around identity, citizenship, and inclusion in South Africa's democracy 30 years on. From my perspective, I've often found this to be quite contested terrain with varying degrees of enthusiasm, ascription, and defiance. So today's discussion should be quite a good one, just based on that kind of, thought from my side. Just in preparation for this discussion today, I watched a video actually by Justice Albie Sachs, one of our great South Africans, where he shares a paper that he wrote in 1989, reflecting exactly on what it means to be, South African. And he starts the paper off by saying, we all know where South Africa is, but do we know what it actually means to be South African? And while he kind of reflects on this, he also shares that he was in Mozambique at the time, and Mozambique itself was kind of seized with the grappling around, a similar question of what it means to be a Mozambican. And he kind of drew some sort of like influence and sort of inspiration around looking to things like, natural beauty, culture, history, and how a combination of those things could actually contribute, to creating identity towards being a South African. So, without too much from my side, I'd like to introduce two great South Africans that I'm joined by and great scholars, Professor William Gumede, founder and executive chairperson, Democracy Works Foundation, and Professor Pierre de Vos, Claude Leon Foundation, chair in constitutional governance, and he's also a professor of constitutional law at UCT. So, to kind of frame our discussion today, what we're going to do is that we're going to hand over to our two professors to give some opening remarks on what they think, just to kind of provoke some thoughts on today's conversation. And then, of course, we will have audience questions, which we'll be taking throughout the discussion so that everybody feels included and is part of this kind of robust and hopefully enriching discussion. So, Professor Gumede, I'm going to hand over to you to give us your opening remarks.
Thank you for inviting me, and also welcome to everyone who are attending. And I'm going to give you an apology because I have a flu. But let me start. I think just the first thing just to say is, unfortunately, we haven't had up to now, since the end of apartheid, we haven't had a imaginative debate over what is a common South Africanism. I mean, it's often the debates have been um, enmeshed in ideology, in sort of ignorance, um, and so on. So now, in a diverse developing country like South Africa, or even Brazil, or Mauritius, we obviously cannot find a solution, a common identity only based on a shared culture, or only on common citizenship, or only on living in a shared space. We have to be a little bit more um, more embracive, and I'm using that word. Now, how do we define a common South Africanist in their context? Because if we can't use the Western models of nationhood. Now, the first thing is that a modern South Africanist has to be a plural one, so and a layered one. So plural meaning multiple identities. So our South Africanness has to be based on multiple identities. So that is very different from, for example, let's just say, a monocultured country like a Lesotho, and so on. Our South Africanness is layered and is plural. Now, what do I mean by that? I think what a multiple identity it really is based on the fact that we are a country that has to be a compromise between there has been a compromise between diverse political group, but also an acceptance of our differences. Now, this acceptance of our differences is part of our South Africanness. So it is very, very important. Acceptance of our differences is a key part of our common identity. And then, for me, the mosaic of the best elements of our diverse societies in our histories and our culture. So let me repeat it again. The best elements of our diverse past in our present, in our histories and our cultures. So it's our identity is multiple. It is diverse, but it involves the best elements of all of our diverse past. I mean, to repeat all of our diverse past. So it would mean then that a common South Africanist cannot be based on white or black and so on, but it has another dimension. It is a common civic identity. So, in addition to just the broader our diversity, there's something else, and the something else is our civic as a civic identity. So, countries like us, we have to build our identity also around our democracy and our constitution. So on the one hand, there's our diversity, and then on the other hand, it's the thing that hold us, all of us together is our common democracy, our common values, our common institutions, and so on. So in our kind of countries, we don't need to have a common language or common culture, but our identity is multiple languages and multiple cultures. And then, in addition to that, is our democracy and its institutions, which becomes also common.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, thank you. Those are very thought-provoking intro remarks there. Professor de Vos?
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you for having me. I said before, so that I really don't know how to answer this question. But let me try and throw out a few provocations. The first one is to ask, why are we asking this question? What is the purpose of this idea of South Africanness? One concern would be that this identity, like other identities, are used in ways to exclude. If you're South African, then there are others who are not South African, and then, it may lead to or exacerbate the Afrophobia, the xenophobia, and so on. It makes you think that you are special, that there is something unique about this place with these boundaries created by colonialism. So South African is a colonial invention, if you will. And that kind of patriotism, nationalism. So I'm just warning against that. On the other hand, for a society to be able to function, for a constitutional democracy like ours to actually function properly, there must be some kind of shared values or shared commitment or understanding or recognition of the interdependence, interconnectedness of people, and a mutual caring for those in that community. I'm not sure I would choose South Africanness or citizenship or whatever you call it as the placeholder for describing that. But I do think one of the problems with Professor that maybe is raised inadvertently by Professor Gumede's idea that yes, we are different. Part of our South Africanness is a recognition and acceptance of difference and a celebration of difference, is that it also then it makes it that difference can of course be it can be exploited, that those differences can be used to break down or resist any attempts at social solidarity. If you will, you can call it Ubuntu, whatever. So for me, the interesting thing is, or the important thing is, how is there something that things we can do? Is the institutions, the way the government is structured, civil society, whatever, to try and foster that kind of recognition of interdependence. If South Africa it remains a country where a few people flourish and most people do not, this is not good for anybody. How can we live in this place? So so I'm, in a way, I didn't answer your question at all, but maybe it helps in some way to get the discussion going.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Prof. It's always good to kind of throw a question back at a person asking a question, just to kind of stimulate some other way of thinking. As we don't all have to think in a homogeneous way. I do also want to ask you, since you kind of have the stage and you've already kind of made sort of a reference towards the Constitution. I'd like to get your thoughts and your views on what the constitutional affirmation may be, for what it means to be a South African. So if you were to look towards the Constitution, what kind of guidance would it kind of give?
Yes, so that's interesting. Of course, the Constitution is based on or is supposedly a expression of the values that you find in Section 1 of the Constitution. And as Justice Sachs said in that clip, the three core values is human dignity, equality, and freedom. I see human dignity there not as in a very liberal kind of way, as something that is about my dignitas, my whether I'm treated well or not. It is about being able to flourish, being able to reach your potential, that kind of dignity. Those values, of course, are they really shared by all of us? It's an aspiration that the people who wrote the Constitution says we are striving towards. Whether those are the kind of values that if you did a survey whether South Africans would embrace, especially as far as people who are not like them are concerned, I'm not so sure. And I think because the Constitution is the one thing that we said in 1994, 96, we have in common. This is what binds us together in our difference. That has placed a lot of pressure on the Constitution because people look around them and say, well, we are not the same. The white people are still privileged. There are still all this inequality. So these promises that we have the shared values, this is nonsense. These people are selfish and they don't want to share, whatever the arguments are. So the Constitution has maybe something. It says it gives an indication of a certain kind of set of values that seems laudable. But it's not uncontroversial to invoke it. And it could have, of course, consequences if we put too much emphasis on the Constitution, because the document itself cannot do anything. It is us, how we behave, how the institutions behave, that really determine a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I think I want to pick up on that and perhaps bring you in here, Professor Gumede. How people respond to that, how people actually enact that. And obviously how people enact it then also translates into how institutions then enact it. And I just want to get your sense, how are we doing on that kind of front? If you were to give us a scorecard, in terms of these shared values that we've talked about here, what would your scorecard be, on that kind of front?
The Constitution as a pillar of our identity is absolutely critical. One has to think about our country because of its divided past and because of our differences, that the Constitution is almost for us a religion, that all of us um, must buy in. And I know some seriously, and we also have parallel constitutions. There is customary things like customary law, for example. You get in some townships where the gangs run the townships. You've got mafias where the taxi mafias, the construction mafias, they are like running almost their own constitutions, parallel their own laws and so on. And we have to deal with that. But let me come back. Why is it so important that we absolutely make it absolutely compulsory that every citizen and every South African buy into this constitution, because this is it. It's our civil religion. If we have multiple identities, the constitution is actually the common identity, and it's very, very important. Of course, we share the same space as South Africans. We're born here, or others who come here become South African, and so on. So that's the sort of, let's call it the Western way of looking at a nationhood. But because of our past, we are also although we are different, we are also interconnected. As Pierre was saying, and then our civil religion that we have to hold on to, and that is why we have to fight really, really hard to make the Constitution the ultimate value document. Now, related to that is a lot of people, let me rather quote Mandela. So Mandela in 1962, when he was in the dock during his political trial, he said, South Africanness can never be defined in relation to one majority community. Now, that is very important. Now, that was during the apartheid era, but even in our era, so South Africanness, a common South Africanness, cannot be defined in relation to one majority community, one color, one ethnic community, or one language. That is very important to understand that, because I started off by saying we've got multiple identities, and we left apartheid because one community tried to assert itself over everyone else. But when the Constitution becomes the basis of a common South Africanness, we cannot have only one culture. And that is quite important, because some people, regrettably, try to identify South Africanness or even Africanness to be an African or to be a South African in a very, very narrow sense. We as South Africa, we cannot define our Africanness in the same way, say, as a Nigerian or Zimbabwean or somebody from Eswatini, because we have a multiple identity. And we were also colonized totally different from many of the other African countries. We were colonized in what is called in mainstream history the New World, in similar ways like Brazil, the US, and in Cuba. And what it means is, in this type of New World type of colonialism, the indigenous people inhabited the country, and then new people came in, and it was a whole mixture of everyone. So then a common identity in that context will have to be a mixture of everyone.
Mm. Yeah, I want to pick up on what you just said there, Prof. When you talk about, it can't be, this one community or this religion or, this race over another. That's not South Africa. I assume it's a feeling, that you get from existing in the country and understanding the history within which you kind of exist contextually. So it's not really something that's tangible so much that, other countries where it's kind of a homogenous society, you kind of know, we all speak the same language, we all have the same kind of culture and those kinds of things in South Africa. But it seems as though there is still some sort of it's like there's an academic understanding of that, but there still seems to be like a tension there, right? A resistance towards what that actually translates to, and people kind of buying into that kind of concept. And what is your thinking around that, and how do we get people to kind of come along, in terms of that kind of thinking or trajectory?
No, absolutely, you're right. There is a tension. Now, the tension is that our founding myth, our identity is based on politics, and that's the tension. Um, and so on, and that's our own unique challenge, and we have to deal with it. So, but importantly, we have to transform to deal with attention. We have to transform our individual self-identity away from narrow self-identity. You're white, you're Zulu, you're colored, you're Indian. That's a narrow color political identities. So what we need to move it from there to a broader South Africanism. It means that if you white or if you colored or if you Indian South African, that's a tiny piece of your identity. Your bigger identity is that bigger South Africans, bigger South Africanness, and that is our challenge. We haven't done, we haven't engaged enough. We haven't done enough work, whether it's in families, in schools, in workplaces, in our communities, in our cultures, to get that across. But I mean, it's our difficulty is in our to creating our identity, our national identity is that is based on politics. For example, if we've had the ANC government for 30 years, where the government was didn't deliver, was increasingly corrupt and incompetent, then it means then it undermined that common South Africanness. And then if many parts of the government don't believe in our constitution and doesn't embrace the constitution, then it undermine our common South Africanness, and that is almost a systemic weakness if a country built its common identity around politics. But that is who we are. We have to build it around politics.
Professor De Vos, I'd like to get your way in on this point as
Yes.
well.
So I am wondering whether I agree with William about the Constitution being the center, just because the Constitution itself is, it's an intervention. It is a tool to try and manage certain things. We are trying to use it almost to the basis for the founding myth of the nation. So I understand that it's promising in the sense that many of the things in the Constitution, the basic values, at least as I understand them in a more post-liberal kind of way, appeals to me personally. But for many people, it will be quite abstract. Many people would be alienated, I worry, by invoking the Constitution, exactly because some of the values and aspirations they find a little bit too scary, too alienating. If you're very religious, you're like, oh my goodness, we have to give women and men the equal rights. Gays can marry. What's going to happen next? So there is contestation. So if we're going to focus on the Constitution as a kind of guiding light for what makes a South African, then I don't think it can just be easily done. The big problem is, I will come back to what I said in the beginning. I think the question is not so much what makes you South African or not. It is what is it that can create in people a feeling of interconnectedness despite the differences. Because, if you live in, people live often, especially maybe more so even white people, live in very can sometimes be quite isolated from the rest of the world. They encounter people who are different from them only on their own terms, in their homes, at the workplace, and so on. And so that makes it, but if this is not only white people, in terms of religion, if you're very conservative, and you're from a religious group, you're going to have a very specific view of the world. So how do you get people who are so different to feel we are responsible for each other? We care about each other, even if we don't know each other. I'm prepared to make some sacrifices or limit or reduce my own benefits and rights, because this is the way that the only way that we as a society will flourish. That is it's a bigger question, and I think a more important question than are we South Africans? What makes us South African? So what can this do? And I will say one thing about it. Of course, I have no idea what can help, but the often these kind of feelings of solidarity develop when people work together on something, when people are take action, when people who are very different from each other see, oh, there is something here that is really important. We're going to work on this together. It creates a kind of affinity for people who are very different from you. And there are not many opportunities in South Africa for people to do so, and people don't have the imagination often to do so. I'm reminded of this because there's one of the movies I give my social justice class to watch is the movie Pride, which is a fictionalization of the story of gays and lesbians in London during the miners' strike in England. Margaret Thatcher, the miners were on strike for many months, and so there was this gay boy who said, but Thatcher hates the miners, Thatcher hates the queers, we are going to help them. And they go to a small little village where the miners are, and of course the miners are all homophobic, they are horrified, but they work together. These people are very different, and this in the end leads to the Labour Party, of which the Labour Union was a strong part, of adopting extremely progressive policies on LGBTQ rights. That kind of solidarity, this is now this is the kind of story that gives you a tear in the eye. Do we do this in South Africa? How do people actually come to the realization that we are very different, but we have this thing in common, and it's in our interest. For my humanity, it would be good for me also to work with other people. So that's a kind of my touchy-feely contribution to the discussion.
Thanks. I appreciate that sharing, Prof. And I will go and look up that movie. But I do, I'm struck by a couple of points that you're saying, and I actually, I agree with both the points that you and Prof. Gumede are actually making. And I think probably what you're saying is that we should be looking at assembling an arsenal almost, that we can kind of look to kind of create this sense of South Africanness. But I really also take the point around us not being exclusionary. And, we've seen what happens once we start to kind of stray into that territory, where people become villainized and targeted and scapegoated and that kind of stuff, which is kind of where we find ourselves in this moment there. But, again, I guess, how do we find that interconnectedness, and how do we all kind of say, like, we all live in South Africa, we love where we live, not just the geographical location of it. We love, ourselves, warts and all, our history, our culture, and all of those kinds of things. How do we then use that kind of departure point to then kind of mobilize towards us finding each other, and that interconnectedness, that you're talking about, and that, unity in our diversity that Prof. Gumede, you also kind of, alluded to. So what becomes that moment? Because if we say then, okay, maybe we mobilize behind what Project South Africa is, which I guess, started from, 30 years ago when democracy kind of dawned. What is Project South Africa? What does it look like today that we can get behind that? So I'd like to kind of hear what your kind of percolations around,
Sure.
what that would look like.
The Springbok rugby team.
That's always a good one.
Yes, well, there is something there, and I'm making that joke, which is in a way not a joke, because for me this is the closest I feel to being a South African, is when South Africa win the World Cup. The problem is, there's a pre-problem, and that is that we are. This is a very difficult thing to start, to make people look at each other, to try and find how and discover the interdependence when the state is dysfunctional, when it appears that the possibility for people to have a better life is quite than their parents had, is reducing and not increasing. So it's a fundamental precondition for the flourishing of this kind of solidarity. And before before anything else, there is the problem of we are being misgoverned, and that it has catastrophic consequences for many people. Not necessarily the people who complains the most, but and it's bad for all of us in the end. So I don't know how to fix that. I once joked and said we must just abolish all the political parties and start all over. Maybe that will help. So yes. So what does the project look like? It sounds, when you start thinking about that, you always think, oh my goodness, I'm starting to sound like a PR person, because you want to say rainbow nation, diversity, all of these things. And that's important. The idea of diversity, of difference, the Constitutional Court has said in some judgments that equality is also about the right to be different. It's not about sameness. Difference is important. It's not something we grudgingly accept. It is something we celebrate. But whenever one then gets projects where people try and exploit that or use that, I often find it becomes quite false. It feels off. It feels a little bit PR-y. So I don't know. The active a kind of world in which we in small ways and large ways work together on anything, in which it is not required for you to be just like, it is expected and celebrated that you are very different from this one. Somebody comes in their khaki clothes and somebody else comes in their Louis Vuitton, and we sit here and oh my goodness, it is a disaster because nobody understands each other. But maybe through the process, we don't become different, but something happens there that says, yes, we share the space, and the space is South Africa. It doesn't matter what myth we tell about the country, whether it's the land of the free and the brave, or what dream it is trying to sell, except that we are in this together in some way. That's for me more important than what the outcome must be, except, I agree with William, it has to recognize the importance of plurality, of diversity. It can only work in a system where difference is accepted and part of the system, and is used as a strength and is not seen as a weakness.
Yeah, I want to bring you in here, Professor Gumede, and perhaps just tack on one more point before you come in. Um, just to build off what Professor De Vos said, is that, on this issue of identity, right? And kind of, cultural identity, religious identity, or whatever, but just taking it back to South African context, that coming from a position where people's identities actually, there was an active project to erase those identities, right? How important is it, to still hold firm to that, while still building the general kind of South African identity? And again, because for me, it occurs to me that, once we start to kind of try and get this overall identity, and we kind of tried maybe, not make as important your individual identity, we again stray into that exclusionary territory that we don't want people to kind of start to feel like, well, my identity is now minimized because now the bigger idea is the South Africanness that we should all kind of be ascribing to. So how important is kind of that kind of recognitions in terms of context and locating it in our discussion?
Yeah. No, thank you. I think it's one of the things, why is our project, our nation building project in crisis? Because the project is in crisis. First thing is, a very big part of building a common South Africanness is we inculcate a solidarity and social justice and compassion across color and across groups. And that's very important. And I think we haven't seen that. We haven't seen a solidarity for those who are struggling, for the poor and for the vulnerable. We haven't seen a solidarity and a compassion across ethnic groups and across race. And that's is very, very important, because that actually make the South African. So no matter what your color is or where you come from, if you can have solidarity and compassion and and care for somebody else who gets hurt, that is not of your color or from your group, um, that is very important that we have that, because that's a core part of our South Africanness. Now, coming back to your question, now we have because apartheid tried to erase um, indigenous identities of people. We need to do two things in this common South African, as we have to um, recognize um, identities that have been written off or have been erased. So that's the first part. Yeah, we have to do that. But then while we're doing that, in those identities, we then have to change that identity at the same time. So, right? We recognize the identities that have been marginalized by apartheid, and now we have to recognize it. But when we recognize it, then we have to take out the anti-democratic and anti-constitutional elements in their identity that we recognize, right? For example, let's say I am, what should I say, should I say any community or my community, if patriarchy is been seen as part, of their identity, because I grew up in that identity where patriarchy is a big thing. I'm the elder son, it gives me certain powers, and so on, and that is a part of the identity. Then we have to say no, because patriarchy as a system is against our constitution, and that means it's against our new common South Africanness. But then we take what are the good things that we can bring back that has been erased from our indigenous identities, and then take out those things that are harmful, because there's many things that are harmful, in our erased identities. I mean, just the way we look at women in our indigenous identities that have been erased. So we have to bring in equality, and that is what the imaginative debate that we must have. Then the other reason why our project, our nation building project, is in crisis is because of the politics. We're building the nation based on politics. Now, if our politics go wrong, then it undermines the project. For example, if the state fails, then it undermines the nation building project, because the state is one of those, like the constitution, our common state is also part of our common identity. But if our common state is corrupt, incompetent, doesn't deliver, then that also undermines our nation project. Then there are, unfortunately for us, many of our politicians, I mean, really many of our politicians, who use division to get votes. So and then undermining our common identity. So what we need to do, I'm really in favor of being hard and really tough on politicians. Anyone who exploit group divisions, if you're elected person, we have to penalize a person so hard that we never get anyone to do that. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really personally, if there's one thing I would really want to campaign for, if at least if you elected as a politician, or if you register a political party, but then you go on and attack deliberately or deliberately cause divisions, among our broader community, that the way we have to do is we have to even take your license away from being a politician, and if you're in parliament, take your seat away, and so on. I mean, those are the things, because we have had many of our present politicians who rise to power cynically by dividing the country.
Yeah, I take your point very well, Prof. Gumede, particularly around this issue of consequence management, that we do not, kind of let things go unsanctioned, because, if you don't sanction them, the assumption is that then there's a condonation that kind of goes with that, and it takes hold, and becomes a culture, right?
Yeah.
And I want to kind of just bring in another question, probably before we go to bring the audience in, who I'm sure are chomping at the bit to have their questions answered. I want to ask around these issues of commemorative days that we have in South Africa, because we have a myriad of commemorative days, as we all know. And I wonder what role those kinds of commemorative days can actually play towards, the building of this identity. And I also want to bring, obviously, like a department or institution, kind of like the Department of Arts and Culture, and what role they would have to play in that sense, if any. What are your thoughts around the importance of that, and how this would play out in kind of getting to this shared identity? Professor De
It
Vos?
is absolutely important that
Oh,
that we now begin to commemorate, also in a diverse way. And unfortunately, up to now, our national Department of Agriculture has been found wanting in that process. It's so we we must use, or reimagine our commemoration, so that we have to commemorate and memorialize the diversity of our society. And it is and that means not only politicians or political parties, because we've been focusing the last 30 years, sadly, on memorializing political parties and political leaders and so on. I mean, our country is not that shallow. I mean, we are much bigger, much broader. Politics is not our only thing. So we need to create. Firstly, we have to memorialize those that have been forgotten and excluded. That's the first. Bring them in, and create memories around them. Then we also have to create new memories. Because we're in the present now. We're not just living in the past. We're living in the present. So we have to create new memories and so on. But the new memories must go beyond politics. I mean, what I really, again, one of the things that I don't know, I feel petty about these issues, is that in our country, the politicians seems to be the big people in our country. I mean, that's not, other non-politicians are more impactful in this country than politicians. So when we memorialize, we have to move beyond politicians. I mean, there are artists, forgotten artists. There are individuals who started institutions, organizations. We have to memorialize them as part of the bigger South Africa. They're sports stars, and so on. And I think in creating this new memory and bringing in the past memory, celebrating the past, the past needs to be diverse. And I want to make a case for a diversity of memorialization.
Yeah, thank you. Professor de Vos?
Yes, so the commemorating days, I don't know if in the contemporary moment culture, those things really can do anything, especially not if the government state entities in any way involved, because it kills any imagination. It is just boring, boring, boring. So so I'm not sure it can do that, and this is something that is very difficult to manufacture top down. Where I see sparks of this, and maybe I'll slightly disagree with you, William, in the sense that tamping down on divisiveness, it's very difficult to know what is divisive. Sometimes people say you shouldn't mention race, you should mention apartheid, it's divisive. You can't mention injustice, it's divisive. So I'm a little bit nervous about how we decide that. When I go to the theater, I see this happening. The theater in Cape Town, at least, you can go to a play that it is searingly critical of or painful about what apartheid event. It can be celebratory. It is a mixed thing, complicated, sometimes not. There are also musicals, so we go to those, but there are also the plays. It's a kind of place. Here is imagination. It is an imagining of how things possibly could be, what it is necessary to have in your life to be able to live a life that is meaningful despite all the difficulties and the trouble around us. So we really need much more imagination. And if we need imagination, the departments of arts and culture cannot be in any way involved. They are really how this, yeah, this is it's the death of imagination. So
Wow.
that would be right.
On that upward note,
So
let's
can I just
end
sort of add something? Just one sort of
Sure.
just add. So, I mean, for example, just
Sure.
at a university, the universities give honorary degrees and so on. I mean, that's really. I mean, this is just one example. It's an opportunity, for example, to recognize and to memorialize through an honorary degree our diversity. Now, what we get often, most of the time, is it goes to politicians, honorary degrees, goes to politicians, and we have memorial lectures, and then it's politicians. So, those are, what I'm saying is, I'm just using that as an example. There are many, many other examples where we really need to celebrate and memorialize the diversity. And maybe, let's say for once, let's not commemorate any politician ever for the next 5 years. Do not bestow any honors on any politician. And, look at the people who've been forgotten, who've been marginalized, but who played really big roles in their communities. And then let's memorialize them as part of the bigger nation building project. And the last one is, I think a lot of South Africans sadly don't think diversity is a good thing. People think diversity somehow undermines, for example, economic growth and all of those sort of things. But it is important for our nation building project that that we understand that diversity is at the heart actually of everything, of our growth, of the job creation, of everything, accepting diversity, I mean.
Thank you, Prof.
And if you
I'm going to
accept
turn.
diversity, you get the Springbok rugby team. We must tell
I'm
people
going to
that
turn
so
to.
that they can embrace it.
I'm going to turn to the audience so they don't feel too left out of our great discussion here. I'm going to pick up a question here from Kevin. Kevin says, this is a great discussion, but will our constitutional democracy withstand the onslaught against democracy currently experienced by democratic countries around the world?
Sure. So this is for me, this is an open question in the sense that there's sometimes a belief that the constitution, the fact that there is a constitution, that the systems, the structures are there, and that there's a constitutional court, that it guarantees the survival of the system because the court will stop it. Well, if you look anywhere in the world comparatively, where a constitutional court has been in direct conflict with the other branches of government, the party who won was never the court. So if you go to Hungary or Poland or whatever, there's a clash. The executive and the legislature decide these people are too big for their boots. They are the ones with the power, the purse strings, the electoral legitimacy, and they will snuff out the court. So this whole thing depends really on what voters will do and whether voters will embrace authoritarian rule, or whether enough voters, citizens, people living in South Africa will resist it if it does happen. Because in the end, it's important that the constitution is there, that there is a constitutional court, all these things, but that is not going to ensure that we remain and become a more vibrant democracy. It's the people who live in it. Unfortunately, the people with the money is going to play a bigger role than the rest of us, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't harm it.
Yeah, sadly. I've got a comment here. It's more a comment, not a question, and then I'll pose a question to you, Professor Gumede. So the comment says, I think the idea of being South African may not be fairly shared because of the vast inequalities in our country, which is, reference to what we've talked about already. We can't share a patriotism sentiment in a country that does not nourish us equally. So I just thought that was an important one to kind of also share in light of the discussion. So this one I'm posing to you, Prof. Gumede. Robin Porteous asks, Albie Sachs often invokes empathy and imagination as democratic tools. How might we embed those values more deeply in public discourse and civic life?
No, empathy is absolutely important, but it's not just empathy because we're so diverse. It was empathy across diversity, and that's the thing that's missing. People will have empathy if it's a person that you grow up with you, and that person is hurt. You'll have empathy, but if it's a person that doesn't look like you, then there isn't empathy. So we really have to build empathy, and I think. And so it has to start off from schools. I mean, we're missing actually. We're not doing enough in the school system to build around, to entrench our constitution. I mean, if you go to the US, for example, you start in school, or not just the US, a country like Sweden or in France, and so on. The first thing that a child learns on arrival at school is the constitution, is a common identity, and you write exams around it. And even in countries like South Korea and Japan, we are not doing it. So it's very, very important that I think we need to teach empathy at that level. But as I say, empathy that goes across race and language and groups, because that's missing now. And that's also why our nascent project is in crisis, because we don't have enough common empathy that goes across to other people that don't look like you.
Thanks, Prof. Okay, I've got another question here from Jamie Benjamin. And maybe Prof. de Vos, you can pick this one up. How do you think the youth today relate to the idea of being South African compared to older generations?
So you're asking someone who's in their 60s.
Yes, exactly.
Difficult. I have no
Yes.
idea, of course. Just as somebody who is teaching at university, when I see students, the kind of things they do, the interactions they have, I'm much less pessimistic than when I watch television or parliament, because um, uh, there's a kind of in strange ways. I don't know if this is, maybe this is my, also I'm sitting in the ivory tower, but it feels to me that the students in some ways more prepared than all the people uh, to live with the complexity of the world that we live in. And it's like a little bit absurd. It's and so on. I do know from my own students that there's also some skepticism about the promises made about what the Constitution can do, and the arguments that some scholars make valid. I think that in the beginning people oversold the Constitution, and it created this impression the Constitution is going to change everything and make everybody equal. Of course, this is nonsense. So there's a bit of skepticism, which is a skepticism that is also informed by some almost disgust of what the politicians do, um, and a kind of living despite of the formal politics, living a different kind of life. Whether this is my observation from the outside, only of students, but so I can't say more than that.
Okay, and let me take a final question. I'll pose this one to you, Prof. Gumede. Dr. Ernst Uken asks, does human rights overshadow Ubuntu?
No, I don't think there's a clash between these two. I mean, it's the same. I mean, I think Ubuntu is human rights, because what does Ubuntu say? It says everyone is seen, and that's human rights is you are seen. Your rights are seen, and that's human rights. It's the same, and so on. So I don't think there's a clash. Um, so I would say that Ubuntu is a human rights-based philosophy, indigenous human rights-based philosophy, because the idea or the central argument of philosophy of Ubuntu is, we care, have empathy for others. But what we need to do is we now have to extend one's group to other groups that are not familiar to one. So we have to take Ubuntu not just in a one group setting, not just in one community setting, but Ubuntu then has to go empathy across not just your own group, but also across other groups.
Thanks, Prof. We have 2 minutes left of our scintillating discussion here, so I'd like to use this moment to perhaps give you each an opportunity just to kind of, on the basis of our reflections for today, what are the things that you would probably want people to kind of take away from our discussion as we kind of grapple again with this concept of South Africanness? Prof. Gumede, since you already have the stage, let's start with you.
Yeah, no, it is very important that we must stop having competing constitutions, because we have competing constitutions in the country now. And what do I mean by competing constitutions? We've got our central constitution, but then we have many people who don't believe in a constitution. Um, um, and many people, as I say, part of the country is actually outside the constitution. If you're in the rural areas now, you're outside the constitution. If you, because there's customary law, there's chiefs and so on, traditional court systems, and all of those sort of things, yeah. Or if you, some of the townships, there's gang constitutions, gang are running those places. So it is very, very important that we assert the centrality of the Constitution in every life and in families and in every community. And we should not tolerate any parallel constitution in the country. It's very, very important for us as a country to embed the Constitution as the only or as a supreme identity forming institution in a country. And maybe the last one, just in terms of every generation, so young people, every generation will have to defend the constitution anew, defend democracy anew, and with new imagination and with new freshness. And I think that's the responsibility of every generation in South Africa.
Thanks, Prof. Prof. de Vos, close us off with your final thoughts.
Sure. Yes, so I will just say this. I read a beautiful novel a few months ago called Small Rain. It's very unpromising because the novel is a 300-page book, Garth Greenwell, in which he is in the hospital describing just what's happening around. But he starts analyzing a small poem written by somebody who had been a communist. And he speaks about recognizing the poem is so good because it sees in the everyday small things the importance, the wonder in it. And he speaks about dignity, the value of dignity, which is like the value of Ubuntu, and speaks about how when he taught this to his students, he would try to explain to them, this means if you see that every person has infinite moral worth, you have to live your life as if every person is as important as the people you love your most. And then for me, the line that I love is he said, and of course, this is impossible to do. It is unbearable to live your life like this. And knowing that it is unbearable is also unbearable. And so I'm saying that because we have been talking here about identity, about difference, living together, trying to have solidarity. This is difficult. Living in a society where this is real, where difference and diversity is actually all around you, is not easy. It is a challenge. It is hard. And people with less resources, it is even harder. So, when you see Operation Dudula, it chills me to the bone, but in some way it is not completely incomprehensible why they do that. So yes, I think it is worth doing. Is that why are you alive? You don't try and think about the hard things, but it is hard. But if we don't do that, this whole project is maybe going to be even more precarious than it is at the moment.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Gumede. Thanks you, Prof. de Vos. I really do believe that this was an enriching discussion, and I'm sure our audience also feels similarly. And on that note, thank you so much, everybody, and goodbye. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Okay, goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.